Good evening and welcome. Tonight we delve into a question that has perplexed philosophers, leaders, and citizens for millennia. Can war ever be morally justified? It is a profound inquiry, touching upon the very essence of our ethical frameworks and the harsh realities of international relations. Joining me to dissect this contentious issue are two distinguished guests. Colonel Marcus Thorne, who will argue that, under exceptionally stringent conditions, war can indeed find moral sanction, and Ms. Anya Petrova, who will contend that war is inherently immoral, and that non-violent alternatives must always be pursued. Our debate will commence with opening statements from each speaker, followed by 2 rounds of moderated discussion, and will conclude with their closing remarks.
Thank you, Dr. Vance. The specter of war is undeniably a human tragedy, a testament to our failings. However, to assert that war can never be morally justified is to overlook the complexities of a world where malevolence and aggression unfortunately persist. I contend that under specific, rigorously defined, and circumscribed conditions, the recourse to armed conflict, however lamentable, can be a moral imperative. This position is not an endorsement of belligerence, but rather an acknowledgement of the grave responsibilities that sometimes fall upon us. The framework of just war theory provides crucial ethical guidance, stipulating stringent criteria for jus ad bellum, the justice of resorting to war. These include a just cause, such as self-defense against aggression, the defense of others facing egregious tyranny, or imminent humanitarian catastrophe. Furthermore, there must be a right intention, meaning the war is waged for the just cause itself, not for ulterior motives like territorial expansion or economic gain. A legitimate authority, typically a sovereign state, must declare the war, and it must genuinely be a last resort. After all viable peaceful alternatives have been demonstrably exhausted or proven futile. Crucially, there must be a reasonable prospect of success, preventing futile sacrifices, and the anticipated universal good must be proportional to the harm the conflict will inevitably cause. In an imperfect world, where aggressors may seek to impose their will through violence, and where fundamental human rights are sometimes systematically violated on a massive scale, a principled, absolute refusal to ever countenance war can, paradoxically, become an abdication of moral responsibility. Such a stance might inadvertently permit far greater suffering and injustice to prevail, effectively abandoning the vulnerable to the depredations of the ruthless.
Dr. Vance, Colonel Thorne, thank you. The assertion that war, an act defined by organized killing and widespread destruction, can be, quote, morally justified, is a proposition I find profoundly troubling. War's very essence, the infliction of death, the devastation of communities, the poisoning of environments, and the deep, enduring societal trauma seems to me inherently irreconcilable with any coherent moral framework. The criteria of just war theory, while intellectually sophisticated, have historically proven dangerously malleable, often contorted to provide specious justifications for conflicts driven by geopolitical ambitions or nationalistic fervor, rather than genuine ethical imperatives. Who truly judges the just cause, or the right intention, without bias, especially when powerful interests are at stake? Moreover, the devastating and frequently indiscriminate impact of modern warfare on civilian populations, on the innocent who bear no responsibility for the casus belli, cannot be overstated. The notion of, quote, proportionality often crumbles when faced with the charred landscapes and shattered lives left in conflict's wake. I advocate for an unwavering commitment to, and far greater investment in, nonviolent alternatives. Diplomacy, robust economic sanctions targeting oppressive regimes, not populations, international criminal justice mechanisms, and concerted efforts to address the root causes of conflict, poverty, systemic injustices, resource scarcity, and ideologies of hate. These are the avenues to true and lasting peace. To suggest that we must resort to the calculated slaughter of our fellow human beings as a, quote, moral imperative is, I believe, a failure of imagination, a failure of courage, and ultimately a failure of our shared humanity. Colonel Thorne, you've eloquently outlined the conditions for a just war, emphasizing principles such as last resort. Ms. Petrova, you've expressed skepticism regarding the practical and unbiased application of these criteria. Let us delve into this concept of last resort. How can we be definitively certain that all non-violent avenues have been thoroughly exhausted, particularly when faced with the harrowing prospect of imminent, large-scale atrocities? Colonel, from your perspective, how critically high is that threshold for intervention? Ms. Petrova, is there any conceivable scenario, however extreme, where the application of physical force might tragically represent the lesser of two evils?
The threshold for a last resort is indeed exceptionally high, Dr. Vance, and should never be approached lightly. It signifies a point where diplomatic channels are demonstrably gridlocked, or moving with such glacial slowness that they become complicit in unfolding horrors. Consider situations of ongoing genocide, such as we witnessed in Rwanda or Srebrenica, or credible imminent threats of mass slaughter, where every diplomatic overture has been met with contempt or cynical delay. Waiting until the absolute 11th hour, until the killing fields are already saturated, if intervention could have demonstrably prevented or significantly mitigated that catastrophe, is not a morally superior position. It is a failure to protect. The moral calculus must meticulously weigh the foreseeable costs and inherent risks of action against the almost certain, devastating cost of sustained inaction in such dire circumstances. It is not about seeking conflict, but about acknowledging that there are, regrettably, extreme moments where the organized application of force may be the only viable means to stop a far greater, immediate, and irreversible evil.
The last resort argument, Colonel, is, I fear, too often a rhetorical device employed to short-circuit the arduous, frustrating, yet essential processes of nonviolent engagement. The claim that, quote, all alternatives have been exhausted, is frequently made prematurely, sometimes because the political will for sustained, creative, and robust non-military pressure is lacking, or because certain outcomes are desired more swiftly. Furthermore, the very act of military intervention is fraught with profound uncertainties and perilous, often unforeseen, consequences. How often have interventions, ostensibly to prevent atrocities, instead triggered wider regional conflicts, engendered deep-seated resentments, or inadvertently empowered other undesirable actors? The success of such military ventures is fiendishly difficult to predict with any degree of moral certainty, and the metrics for success are themselves often contentious. Even in the most extreme imaginable circumstances, our primary focus, our overwhelming investment of resources and ingenuity, must remain steadfastly on non-military forms of protection, on humanitarian corridors, on robust international legal action against perpetrators, and on de-escalation, however formidable the challenge may seem. To concede that physical force is the, quote, lesser of two evils, is to accept a framework where evil is inevitable, a premise I believe we must constantly strive to transcend. Let us pivot to another critical tenet of just war theory, the principle of proportionality. This dictates that the overall harm inflicted by acts of war must not outweigh the good that is intended to be achieved. Colonel Thorne, given the inherently unpredictable and often devastating trajectory of armed conflict, how is this delicate balance of proportionality practically assessed and maintained, especially in the fog of war? Ms. Petrova, from your perspective, which emphasizes the intrinsic devastation of warfare, can this condition of proportionality ever be genuinely and ethically met? Dr. Vance, the concept of achieving, quote, proportionality in war, when weighed against the profound and often multi-generational trauma inflicted, strikes me as an almost impossible ethical calculus, if not a dangerous illusion. The immediate, visible good, perhaps the removal of a tyrant, is often starkly contrasted with the less immediate but far more pervasive and enduring harms. The complete unraveling of societal fabric, the creation of millions of refugees, the environmental devastation, the psychological wounds that fester for decades, and the almost inevitable perpetuation of cycles of violence and retribution. These long-term consequences are frequently downplayed or unforeseen in the strategic calculations that precede conflict. Yet they constitute the lived reality for those who must endure its aftermath. The good achieved through military force is so often subjective, contested, and tragically temporary, whereas the harm, the loss of innocent lives, the destruction of heritage, the seeding of future conflicts, is concrete, devastating, and appallingly permanent. True. Sustainable peace necessitates addressing the underlying root causes of conflict: inequality, injustice, historical grievances, not the imposition of military solutions that often exacerbate these very issues.
Ms. Petrova raises undeniably critical points about the long-term repercussions of conflict, and I concede that assessing proportionality is perhaps one of the most challenging moral and strategic endeavors in warfare. It is not a precise science, but a sober, continuous process of weighing the foreseeable consequences of military action against the equally foreseeable, and often more dire, consequences of not acting, particularly in the face of aggression or mass atrocities. This is where the principles of jus in bello, justice in the conduct of war, become paramount. These include the principle of discrimination, which mandates distinguishing between combatants and non-combatants, and the principle of proportionality within specific military operations, ensuring that collateral damage is minimized relative to the military advantage sought. Adherence to stringent rules of engagement, transparent investigation of errors, and a commitment to minimizing civilian harm are not merely aspirational. They are fundamental to the ethical conduct of any justified military engagement. Mistakes, tragic and regrettable, are made in the crucible of conflict. However, the intent, grounded in the initial just cause and the overarching aim of achieving a greater proportionate good or averting a demonstrably greater evil, must remain the guiding principle, however imperfectly realized at times.
In conclusion, I must reiterate my profound conviction. War, in its essence and in its consequences, represents an abject failure of our collective humanity, a descent into a calculus of destruction that belies our capacity for empathy and reason. The path to a more secure and just world does not lie through the barrel of a gun, however compelling the supposed justifications. Instead, we must courageously and relentlessly pursue a global paradigm shift, investing our vast resources, intellect, and energy into robust peace-building initiatives, into equitable conflict resolution mechanisms, and into addressing the deep structural drivers of violence that plague our societies. It is an appeal to our shared humanity, to the unyielding imperative to discover and implement genuine alternatives to the devastation of violent conflict, for the sake of this generation and all those to come.
I wish to conclude by reaffirming that war is, and always will be, a profound tragedy, an option that must only ever be contemplated as a true and verifiable last resort, when all other avenues have been exhausted. However, a doctrinaire, blanket refusal to even consider its moral permissibility in the most extreme circumstances, such as confronting an unambiguous, genocidal aggressor or preventing imminent mass slaughter, can constitute a grievous dereliction of our fundamental duty to protect the innocent and uphold universal human values. The arduous pursuit of justice and the defense of liberty sometimes necessitate profoundly difficult, morally challenging choices in an imperfect world. It is not a choice made with alacrity, but with the gravest solemnity, acknowledging the immense responsibility it entails.
Colonel Thorne, Miss Petrova, I extend my sincere gratitude to you both for your exceptionally insightful, articulate, and passionate contributions to this evening's incredibly challenging yet vital discussion. You have compellingly illuminated the profound core tension that defines this debate. The universal aspiration for enduring peace juxtaposed against the perceived, agonizing necessity of intervention in certain extreme, morally fraught circumstances. The questions raised tonight concerning just cause, last resort, proportionality, and the long-term consequences of conflict do not admit easy answers. It is my hope that this discourse has provided our audience with substantial food for thought, encouraging continued reflection on the complex ethical dimensions of war and peace. Thank you for joining us. Good evening.